Remember Chance the gardener, the character in Being There? Chance has been raised in isolation. There's something wrong with him. Most of his information has come from television. He doesn't really know anything. But as he ventures out into the world, he is mistaken for a savant. People who are so hungry for leadership, for some kind of out-of-the-box view of a chaotic world, gravitate towards him. It's clear at the end of the movie, even though he's a complete fool, he's going to become president. And in his new book, critic James Poniewozik paints a similar picture of Donald Trump, a product of television, somebody who knew the world through television, who became known through television, who in essence is a television character. We'll talk more about that after the news.
For some people, the ultimate goal in life has been becoming the President of the United States. Would you like to be the President of the United States?
I really don't believe I would, Ronna.
Why wouldn't you dedicate yourself to public service?
Because I think it's a very mean life. And I also see it that somebody with strong views and somebody with the kind of views that are maybe a little bit unpopular, which may be right, but may be unpopular, wouldn't necessarily have a chance of getting elected against somebody with no great brain but a big smile. And that's a sad commentary for the political process.
Television, in a strange way, has ruined that process, hasn't it?
It's hurt the process very much. I mean, the Abraham Lincolns of the world. Abraham Lincoln would probably not be electable today because of television. He was not a handsome man, and he did not smile at all. He would not be considered to be a prime candidate for the presidency, and that's a shame, isn't it? The country, if we had the one man, and it's really not that big a situation. You know, people say, well, what could anybody do as president? The one man could turn this country around. The one proper president could turn this country around. I firmly believe that.
All right, that's Donald Trump. I think you knew that. But it's 1980. He's talking to Rona Barrett, October 6th, 1980. So we're right on the cusp, actually, of a television and movie actor getting elected president, a guy who was pretty good looking and did smile. Apparently, Abraham Lincoln, who I'm sure Trump knew nothing about, except what he'd seen on television or something, was not like that. But so we were going to have a president who was an actor and sometimes seemed to be acting as president and also seemed to occasionally confuse television and movie scripts that he'd been involved with reality. So Trump, meanwhile, is kind of saying a guy like him who can never get elected president, he might have been right at that moment. But as James Poniewozik illustrates in his new book, Audience of One, Donald Trump, Television and the Fracturing of America, television and media and the way in which our entertainment culture overlap with our political process was going to change over the ensuing 35 years in such a way that obviously somebody like Donald Trump, even the way that he describes himself, could win the presidency and did. So James Poniewozik is with us right now. It's exciting to have you. And what else do I need to say before we get going here? Well, that you're chief television critic for the New York Times. So we just listened to that clip. We hear Trump essentially saying that he couldn't, someone like him could never make it. And in many ways, the whole thrust of your book is asking the question, well, what changed? You know, what changed in those 35 years? I don't know. You want to pick one or two things to get us started?
Sure. I mean, I think that's exactly right. It's how did we get there from here? Because I think he was essentially right. Somebody like the Donald Trump that we see today, you know, scowling, angry, provoking, you know, probably could not have gotten elected in the TV era of that time. And, you know, a couple of things that happened over the course of that time, sort of the two parallel stories of the book, is number one, that Donald Trump made himself into a television celebrity. He is essentially, I think he is more significant to the country as kind of a 35-year TV performance, a TV character, than as, you know, an actual biographical person. Number one. And number two, television changed and the larger electronic media changed. And the nutshell, you know, quick description of how it changed is that it went from a mass medium to a niche medium. We went from the time when there were three major networks and everything on the air sort of had to be broadly, you know, often blandly appealing, to a point when you have all sorts of media outlets that are micro-targeted at micro-audiences, and their raison d'etre is to provide things that are not for everybody, but that are very specifically for an intensely interested group. And that both changes the business of television, obviously, but it also kind of changes the tone and the content of television so that, it becomes a more hospitable environment for more polarizing figures. So, broad strokes, I think those are the big things that changed from then to here.
Yeah, and we're going to explore all of those things if we have enough time here as we go along. I want to begin, though, kind of where you begin, which is the miseducation of Donald Trump. Or how does he, even as a child, one of the things that fascinates me about Trump is he doesn't really cite culture that much, specific instances of popular culture. We know, I don't know who his favorite Beatle is, and probably neither do you. I learned more from your book about what a movie is to him or what television is to him than I've learned studying him pretty closely, though, these last few years. So it's an interesting question anyway that you explore. How did he study television? What was popular culture to him as he grew up?
Yeah, I don't know if he studied television so much as he intuited it. It is sort of interesting that he is somebody who is both a creature of popular culture and yet has very specific interests and seeming blank spots. But, I think it's, when you look at his early life, when you look at The Art of the Deal, for instance, his first book, he doesn't talk a lot about his childhood. But one of the few memories that he relates is watching his mother, who was a Scottish emigre, sit down in front of the television all day when he was about 7 years old and watch the coronation of Queen Elizabeth on television. And it's sort of the first, it's the first time that we have seen the live or almost live, the coronation of a monarch. And it's kind of an example of the new world that kids of his era are being introduced to, where there is suddenly this second virtual place in your living room that can, bring you an ocean away and show you these images of grandeur and majesty and ceremony. And, he talks about how his mother was swept away by the glamour and the ornament of it all, as opposed to his father, who was much more practical and business-minded, and describes it as sort of a formative experience for him in that way. But I think in another way, it was really it was an example of how he was starting to realize the power of this new thing that existed in the world, right? You have the contrast between this and his father's real estate business. Well, nobody's mother sits around all day entranced by the workings of a construction crane, right? But television, that's magic. It's literally something almost magical. And he, I think, decided early on, he early on in his career, he toyed with the idea of going off to Hollywood and working in the entertainment business. And then he decided not to, but he said early on, I'm going to bring show business into real estate. And what I think that essentially meant for him was that, having seen this, gotten this glimpse of this magic power of showbiz glamour, he knew that courting celebrity was sort of, that was a power that you could leverage into other things.
Right. So I want to stay a little bit with the time of his childhood and things that he might have been influenced by, just for another minute or two. So we're going to hear from The Magical World of Disney, Season 1, Episode 14, Davy Crockett Goes to Congress. I think we're hearing Fess Parker here as Davy Crockett.
Why, Davy, I didn't expect you back for a week.
I know.
Now, Davy, if you're worried about the Indian bill, it's all over. They've already passed it.
They'll have to change their minds.
I'm warning you, Crockett. Go in there and you're committing political suicide.
You know what I think about your kind of politics?
So you're actually hearing Davy Crockett punch out some politician at the end here. And there's a way in which Trump maybe is influenced by that idea that a decisive thing that you could do is punch somebody out. He doesn't really seem to be the guy who does that, but he eventually gets involved with the World Wrestling Federation. There's ways in which one of the things that he sees is this kind of rough and tumble version of reality.
Yeah, he's at least attracted by the theater of it. You're right. It's not like, Donald Trump is, actually going and punching out lawmakers in the halls. But a lot of his rhetoric is sort of about nostalgia for a time when, people settled things, often violently and with their fists, right? He's just talked about that a lot at his rallies. Back when we were strong and wise, we used to rough up protesters, that sort of thing. And I think that if you look at the television of his youth, you can still see, you can sort of see the mindset of the adult Donald Trump who became a political figure. This notion of, how red-blooded men solve disputes, this kind of fathers knows best concept of masculinity. And as you say, one of the programs that we know that Donald Trump, as a young boy, was fascinated by was he was a fan of professional wrestling, professional wrestlers, and he ultimately would become, as a real estate and hotel entrepreneur, drawn into the world of wrestling, first hosting WrestleManias at his properties in Atlantic City, and then actually becoming a character in the world of the WWE and sparring with Vince McMahon and having scripted fights with him. He is a WWE Hall of Fame member. You can look it up. And again, this was, in a way, kind of training for the persona that he presented as a political figure and leader. A lot of the stuff, if you go up and if you pull up video of, one of his rallies and look at it through the frame of wrestling, so much of it is WrestleMania-like theater. The cheering crowd, the way that the crowd will get going, and he'll step away and kind of raise his arms and, encourage the sound to build, like he's like Hulk Hogan literally used to do that. Mm-hmm. I think that he got a lot of sort of rudimentary theatrical training in those early years in front of the tube.
Right. And of course, those circles started to overlap even earlier with Jesse Ventura. And of course, I live here in Connecticut, where both Richard Blumenthal and Chris Murphy had to defeat Linda McMahon, wife of Vince, in order to become U.S. senators. So yes, we know that somehow or other the style, the theatrical style, violent but fake, of wrestling began to line up in kind of an interesting way with American political theater. But it's, and so the fight becomes a very interesting thing to Trump. And so one of the things, early parts of your book, that blew my mind, because really I've been trying to figure out, like, what does this guy watch except for himself on the news and people kind of talking to him through the, what does he ever, what movie ever meant anything to him? So you revealed two things. One of them was that he thought about going to film school, hard to know how seriously, but not so he could become some sort of auteur. But his idols weren't Orson Welles or Stanley Kubrick, right? They were movie moguls, the business of it.
The guys who ran the studios, Louis Mayer and those types. I think he couldn't imagine himself as the creative even at that point. And it's funny you hear him. Errol Morris, the documentarian, did an interview with him several years back where he asked him about the movie Citizen Kane, and his Donald Trump's conclusion that he drew from it was, well, clearly Charles Foster Kane just needed a good woman. So maybe that was the best choice. He did not necessarily have the instincts of an Orson Welles. And another, I don't know if you were building up to this, but another early story of one of his pop cultural fascinations was the reason that he was sent off to military school by his father as a young man was that he discovered a collection of young Donald Trump's switchblades, which he had because he and his friends were fascinated with West Side Story. Mm-hmm. And again, there's the fascination, what's the thing that grabbed him, as a young boy about West Side Story? It wasn't, Maria. I've just met a girl named Maria. It was the fights,
right?
And that that theater of fighting. So, I think that was an interesting bit.
And so one of the other things you cited, I think it's from a Michael Singer profile in the New Yorker, is Trump on his plane, and he's trying to watch something else, and whatever it is, it's Michael, which is this kind of Nora Ephron-y, John Travolta comedy about an angel, and it's just too much talking and stuff. Like he switches to Bloodsport, but even that has too much plot, backstory, and narrative, right? He just wants the fights.
And he has Eric Trump, the young Eric Trump, in the plane with him, and he has Eric fast forward through it, so he manages to watch it in about, I think it was like 20 or 40 minutes by only showing the fight scenes. Right. So that was, much later in the campaign. I don't know if you were going to get into this, but there was this joke that somebody made on Twitter just after he became president that his aides had created a fake gorilla channel on the cable TV in the White House because Donald Trump, only wanted to watch TV shows of gorillas fighting, and it was fake. It was a joke on Twitter that somebody believed that the person who made the joke had to deny it, but in fact, Eric Trump create him sort of a rudimentary form of the gorilla channel on his plane watching that Jean-Claude Van Damme movie. So, there's a kernel of truth in that.
Right. And to go back to Citizen Kane, I mean, the other thing is Citizen Kane, really, it kind of gets back to a cool question of a primal psychic wound. And so it's no wonder that Trump doesn't want to understand the movie, because he would not want to think about whatever primal psychic wound Fred Trump or whoever.
Particularly in an entrepreneur. I mean, if you read, biographies or interviews with him, he seems almost determinedly to avoid that sort of self-reflection, and introspection to the point where, and I mean, I'm not saying that this is not true, but he has said several times that he has never cried.
Right.
And that may well be true, which, certainly says one thing about a person. It also says another thing if somebody just does not want to confront the notion of even that small amount of very common vulnerability.
All right, so I'm going to offer you one of my theories, which is that, and I want somebody to ask Trump about this at some point. I'd be willing to bet my car, which is not a very good car, but I'd be willing to bet my car that at some point Donald Trump owned a copy of the Don Rickles record, Hello, Dummy. And one of the reasons I think that, obviously, is that a lot of Trump's humor has a lot of the belittling, transgressive, ethnic race-baiting stuff that Rickles did. But for me, because I'm kind of a comedy nerd, he also uses a Rickles beat. And I'm going to show you and the audience this right here. So we're going to hear Rickles, and then we're going to hear Trump. Just listen for where the beat is.
That's right, I make fun of my own people. We're the chosen people, that's right. But what does it mean? We're human beings. Jew, Gentile, Irish, Negro, Puerto Rican. Puerto Rican, that's trouble.
If she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know. But
it's nothing you can do, folks. Second Amendment people, maybe there is. It's actually, he's got a Rickles beat that's in there. He's doing that one of the things you write about in the book, James Poniewozik, is the way that Trump often exists in this kind of quantum state. Was that a joke? Was he serious? Should we make fun of him? Is he making fun of us? That's an example of a line that kind of works as a joke, but also could be serious.
Yeah, two very good points. Number one, he totally, even more than the content, does have that cadence of an insult comic. You hear that over and over in the rallies. There are these people out there who said I couldn't win. These experts, they're all idiots. I won't name their names and embarrass them. I'll give you some names. He does over and over. And you saw it also, I think that was one thing that worked excellently well for him on The Apprentice. That, he had this sort of, kind of punchy style of delivery that, worked very well in that format. And he absolutely, and I think this is key, it's a key to his showbiz persona over the years that ended up being very useful to and key to his political campaign. He's thrived in these environments where he's simultaneously serious and kidding. And, that's one reason, for instance, that he was such a voluble and popular talk show guest. Letterman had him on some 30 odd times. He was great for a format like that, where he's sort of simultaneously a figure of fun, and yet also his reputation, his stature is being inflated just by his presence and by Letterman teasing him about his wealth. And he'll constantly be saying things that, sort of are provocative and kind of cross the line. And then he'll say, I'm just kidding when I say that, folks.
Right.
And, he adapted that very much to his campaign. I was being satirical when I said Russia should get Hillary's emails. Can't you folks take a joke?
Right. So we're going to circle back to the Letterman thing in the next segment, but I want to just bring up one more thing that you nailed down in a nice way. Once again, I've been looking at this guy and trying to figure out who mattered to him. Like, one of the things that I concluded is he probably doesn't have a favorite Beatle because age-wise and disposition-wise, he probably was a little bit more enticed by Elvis. But we don't really know that. He doesn't talk about Elvis. He just that's just sort of an instinct I have. You do figure out that Hugh Hefner means something to him, right? This is maybe one of the people that he looked at and thought, I could kind of be that guy.
Yeah, I mean, friends of his from his years in military school would talk about how Playboy was, a big thing. Just Playboy and the Playboy lifestyle. Like, I'm sure that Playboy appealed to him in the way that, Playboy appealed to a lot of teen boys at the time. But also, Hefner in particular as a model, the lifestyle, Hefner, in a way was very much a proto-Trump in that he was not just, a businessman. He was not just a business icon who launched this big American brand, but he was the mascot of the brand. He was sort of, his chief customers by embodying its principle and its lifestyle, in himself. He sort of became the face of it and kind of the display model for the for the Playboy lifestyle, in much the same way that Trump would sort of be the kind of public face of the Trump organization through his media omnipresence. And there is this recurring thing, both in the tabloid Trump of the 80s and so on, and the Trump on the campaign trail, of modeling this kind of Rat Pack era masculinity. To your question about Trump's musical taste, whatever he has, is funny. Is an interesting question in and of itself. It's hard for me to imagine him having a favorite Beatle because his sensibility seems to be so much more Sinatra. It's like that 60s, rather than the countercultural 60s.
Right. So we're talking to James Poniewozik. The new book is Audience of One, Donald Trump, Television and the Fracturing of America. We're going to take a quick break here. We're going to come back. We're going to talk about the shift in the television landscape and the way in which Trump, as a famous person, began to march in a certain kind of lockstep with that.
You're fired. You're fired. I'm Icy Short, a.k.a. Icy Trump Short. And I fire you. And I fire her. And I fire him. And I fire them.
Excuse me, where's the lobby?
Down the hall and to the left.
Thanks.
Donald. Mr. Trump here wrote The Art of the Deal. Then he wrote a new bestseller, The Art of the Comeback.
2 books. Wow. Well, that must have been tough, coming up with that much material.
No.
Must have been hard getting started, though, right?
First day, 9 chapters.
Ron said his client had a rich uncle, but Donald Trump.
I like keeping a low profile.
Hey, Mr. Trump. Hey, how you doing? Will Smith. Hey, listen, you are getting a great house here. And this is quite a deal you're getting for it, too. Look, I'll tell you what. Go in another 50 grand, I cut the grass for you every Saturday.
Thank you for ruining my life!
Ashley!
What did you do?
Everybody's always blaming me for everything.
All right, that's a montage of Trump cameos in Home Alone 2, Spin City, and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air. I would like to point out that in the Spin City cameo, you hear the voice of Alan Ruck, who is also known for Ferris Bueller's Day Off and now Succession, 2 movies that you would probably want to cite at some point if you were trying to assemble some kind of Rosetta Stone for understanding the rise of Trump through popular culture. And the person who does things like that is our guest, James Poniewozik, author of Audience of One, Donald Trump, Television, and the Fracturing of America. Oh, I think we might have lost James Poniewozik. We will. We are reestablishing contact with James Poniewozik. So I'll tell you what. While we're doing that, I was going to subject James Poniewozik to my theories, but I'll fill a little time here right now by saying that one of the things that I want to explore is the way in which the reality television rose up at a very specific time. One of the things that I believe is that popular culture, in a way that's not entirely self-conscious, not entirely conscious, responds to things that are happening in the world. So I'm going to give you an example. One of the things that James writes about, and we are working hard to reestablish contact with James, but one of the things that he writes about, one of the people that he singles out is Richard Hatch. You might have heard this in the promos for the show too. That Richard Hatch, who was the guy who won the first season of Survivor. And if you remember him, he was this kind of doughy guy who was not particularly likable. Sociopath is probably too strong a word, but he was a sort of a manipulative, conniving guy. He wasn't as popular with the audience or even with the crew there on that simulated island as other characters. So people weren't really rooting for Richard Hatch to win. And then he did win. And it was sort of titillating to people, right? It was kind of, if you remember back to that time, it kind of was thrilling to think that somebody so unworthy could beat people. Like there was a guy there who was like a veteran, was kind of a, much more resourceful and conventionally heroic guy, that this other guy could beat that guy. But I also think, and that begins the rise of reality television. I also think that one of the things that you were seeing there, the beginning of reality television. So this happens in 2000. Think of what happened in the 1990s. One of the things that happened in the 1990s is it was the beginning of our sense that the workplace and other public spaces of life needed a little bit more policing than it had been getting. And very specifically, for example, the kind of anti-sexual harassment training that you typically get in most companies today. It really started in the 90s. It started in particular as a result of certain court decisions. There was one that came out of Tennessee with a forklift company there that where the financial penalty for tolerating an environment where men were allowed to go around being jerks and making people miserable was that the penalty should be high. And so this company had to pay this huge judgment. And so companies started to panic. They started to worry. They thought, obviously, as we now know, not all companies had this reaction, but the 90s was the beginning of this idea that, wow, maybe we just can't let people run around the workplace being, for want of a better term, a-holes. And so that began to be scrubbed out a little bit. It was the first incursion, the first sense that maybe this kind of Don Draper, Mad Men version of the American workplace was not going to survive. And one of the things that I believe, one of my cultural theories, is that anytime we celebrate something, we're often taking note of its impending demise. So, for example, when we were watching a lot of TV shows like Northern Exposure, Twin Peaks, Picket Fences, they were all kind of out at the same time. That was really the exact moment where the kind of idiosyncratic small town that was celebrated in these series was beginning to die out, that this kind of genetic code of CVS and Boston Market and, that was beginning to take over. Every small town was starting to look like another small town. So one of the things that I had concluded was that Richard Hatch and then all of the loutish jerk behavior, this notion of reality television as a place where you'd see a lot of guys walking around without their shirts on often, being jerks, being, for want of a better word, a-holes, was a way of sort of transferring a culture that was in the process of being extirpated. It was in the process of being expunged in real life. And so it was going to be preserved and celebrated someplace else. And that someplace else was reality television. And so then kind of in the middle of that pipeline, you also get Trump as a reality TV star. And as we know, he is kind of that guy. He's not that different, as James Poniewozik points out from Richard Hatch. And speaking of James Poniewozik, we have him back. So I've been vamping here while we lost you. And I've been having a lot of
pro. I'm sure you did a great job.
I'm having a lot of fun doing it. So I want to go back to where I started it, as I thought I was throwing it to you. One of the things that you talk about is, the kind of cusp that Trump occupies as he starts going down the television slide in 1980s. It's sort of, there's been this kind of anodyne television culture that you describe as the search for the least objectionable program.
Right.
Flesh that out for us a little bit.
So the least objectionable program was a TV programming term in the 20th century that described the kind of programming that you put on back in the 3-network era when everything had to draw an audience of tens of millions. And basically the idea was that you wanted to not give people a reason to change the channel. It's a much different programming strategy from what you have in the cable era. And what that meant was that things were sort of broadly palatable, less edgy. The good guys won. There was a little something for everybody, that kind of like big tent Ed Sullivan philosophy of television, and that really dominated television's early decades. What would ultimately change that is the introduction, right around the time that, Donald Trump's talking to Rona Barrett and then becoming a personality in the 80s, the introduction of cable, which slices and dices the audience and it changes the business model. It creates a business model where you need to give people active reasons to tune in, not avoid giving them reasons to tune out.
Right. And so I think another thing that happens kind of at the end of that decade is, because cable is coming along, and also just because it's been going too long and there are other voices entering the fray, there are these people who begin to occupy our attention by saying, what if this is all just crap? One of them, I think, is Gary Shandling doing the Larry Sanders Show, where it's kind of this peek behind the scenes of just incompetent, self-serving, self-dealing messes of fragile egos. And then the other one in real life is David Letterman, who one of his fundamental questions in the 90s was, what if this is all just crap? What if none of it's very good? And so, as you said in the first segment, one of the people that he finds as a convenient target for this kind of exploration is Donald Trump. Here we go.
Speaking of fights, explain to me now what you were thinking about the Mike Tyson situation. Shortly after the verdict was announced that he had been convicted, he was guilty of the crime, you had a plan. Now, what were you thinking?
What was I thinking?
Yeah.
I was thinking that as soon as he gets out, he's going to fight at my casinos.
Yeah, but you can't buy your way through.
Of course, I'm only kidding when I say that, folks.
I wish I could say that.
Mike Tyson.
Right. So Letterman was interviewed during the Trump presidency by New York Magazine. He said about Trump, he was a joke of a wealthy guy. We didn't take him seriously. He'd sit down and I would just start making fun of him. He never had any retort. He was big and doughy and you could beat him up. He seemed to have a good time and the audience loved it. And that was Donald Trump, which is, I think, James Poniewozik, very much the conclusion you arrive at, too.
I mean, one reason that he's great for shows like that is that, you don't necessarily want to book an actual business titan on the show. Success in actual business can be boring, but he was great television in that sense. And he was sort of this, this kind of figure of fun that people, he came on and people knew just what they were getting. And that sort of, that performance, that sort of, quasi-ridiculous, New York braggy buffoon character that Trump developed in the 80s and into the 90s, that's really a natural fit for this kind of, winkingly parodic age of irony TV that's developing on television at the time, which you're right, that was so much in the spirit of television then. The Simpsons, when it came out, was, half a show about pushing back against the phoniness and ridiculousness of television. And Letterman was certainly a conducive environment for that for Trump.
Right. So, so many things that I want to talk about here, but first of all, the other thing that I was reminded of in all of this is Fran Lebowitz's line that Trump is a poor person's idea of a rich person.
Yeah.
And I think that's sort of like one of the things you're seeing in these Letterman appearances too. But the other thing you're seeing, you said, it's sort of a bragging buffoon, not necessarily an enticing person, but we're also entering this era. I mean, it's not a new idea. If you take Satan out of Paradise Lost, you have a really long, boring poem, but we're entering this era where we're going to gravitate towards people who are not necessarily admirable, but they are going to occupy our attentions in a way that they maybe previously haven't. So while you were gone, I did a long disquisition on Richard Hatch, so you don't have to do Richard Hatch.
Okay, great.
But you know, in our popular culture, in our fictional culture, we're starting to see the Tony Sopranos come in, the people with whom we may empathize, even though they're horrific.
Yeah, there was, there had been an element of this in popular culture, the notion of like J.R. Ewing, the villain that you love to hate. But it certainly flourishes much more as you have a more fragmented TV environment. And, HBO can create a show like The Sopranos, which you couldn't have put on NBC in 1967 because, it's selling subscriptions to people who want to watch something that they can't see somewhere else. And all these shows are kind of presenting a sophisticated idea of morality beyond guys in white hats and guys in black hats. They're showing you people who may be terrible, but they're very charismatic. They're fascinating. You want to know what makes them tick. You can't stop watching them. And there are a lot of, other factors in the culture that play into this and that cause these anti-hero figures to be popping up all over the place. 9/11 happens, and suddenly you have a figure in the culture like Jack Bauer from 24, who sort of, rises on the notion of this is an ugly world. And, he may be this rough-edged guy who tortures people to get information. But look, these are the ugly times that we live in. And sometimes it takes ugly deeds to get the job done.
Right. And I think another thing that happens, and yeah, Bauer's a great example of that, because somebody like me, left of center, peacenik, I'll be watching this show and going, there's a battery right in the room, Jack. Hook his nipples up to the battery and torture him. What are you waiting for? And I think another example of this, you used to write for Salon. I freelanced for Salon a little bit later. So I wrote a piece for Salon the morning after the last episode of Breaking Bad. And the theme of it was kind of that Walter had become a monster. Of course he had to die. Sorry, spoiler. But of course Walter had to die. He had turned into a monster. And Mr. Poniewozik, what those Salon comment threads were often like. And so
sure.
I got all these comments from guys, they were all guys, I'm sure, saying, oh, no, He wasn't a monster. He was a hero. He was sticking it to the man. He had seized control of his own destiny. How can you say he's a monster? He wasn't a villain. He was a hero. And I'm thinking, whoa, I don't think Vince Gilligan thinks that, but it's a little bit alarming that you do.
Yeah, he was taking care of his family, right? He was looking out for his own. And it's sort of understandable in a way because kind of the way drama functions, how do you keep people invested in a show like that? Well, for one thing, you set Walter White in all these you put him in all these fixes where he comes out with ingenious solutions, and it's tremendously entertaining and tremendously well told, and you want the story to keep going on, so that sort of naturally psychologically puts you in a position of kind of rooting for him, even if you do think he's a monster. And he's often opposed with people who are even more vicious than him. But that's as TV becomes sort of more artistic in a lot of these ambitious cable shows, it's doing something that a lot of great art does, which is it is asking you to draw the moral conclusions without holding your hand and marching you through it. And Breaking Bad, I think, is a very highly morally conceived show. I mean, it's got bad in the title. It's it is telling you this is the story of a man's journey toward evil. But it doesn't force you to reach that conclusion to draw it. And, it inadvertently tapped into a lot of ugly stuff among, I agree. It was like largely guys who watched it who saw this was a man, just being a man and doing what he had to do. And, in the words of Gustavo Fring, Giancarlo Esposito's character from Breaking Bad, a man provides, and that's what to them, Walter White was about. It was like putting down, suppressing the prissy norms of society and embracing your manhood.
Right. I mean, there was a famous Charles Addams cartoon years ago. It just showed a movie theater audience, and everybody in the movie theater audience is crying, except for this one ghoulish, Charles Adams type guy who's laughing.
Yeah. Joker. Joker, 2019.
Yeah, that. But also, I think, one of the things that Breaking Bad illustrated was now it's like it's 50-50. Half the audience is crying and half the audience is laughing. Half of the audience is deploring, half the audience is cheering. We no longer have the same vision or the same set of reactions to this, the equal fact patterns.
Yeah. And, these aren't phenomena that are solely being created by media and entertainment, obviously. I think that a lot of the reasons that you're getting these comment section dudes, the same with, the manosphere online and, incel culture and so on is this, it's this manifestation of pushing back against larger changes in the society where, women are more empowered, where more people have a voice, and there's this, sort of retrograde action against it that this kind of reaction is it's sort of channeling. It's tapping into that, even if inadvertently.
All right, we're going to take a quick break. Don't go anywhere this time. I'm talking to the guest and the audience. As Larry Sanders would say, no flipping. We'll be back with James Poniewozik after this.
Take my trunks off, and I'ma make the bottles pop. Donald Trump talk, and I'm a Donald Trump walk, and I'm a Donald Trump walk.
And that's the news. Good night, David. Good night, Chet. Good night, Mika. Good night, Joe. Good night, Anderson. Good night, Rachel. Good night, Sean. Good night, Shepard. Good night, Wolf. Good night, Bull. Good night, Mush. Today's show was produced by Jonathan McPants and me, Kyone Wolf. The part of Bill Curry was played by Richard Hatch. Now, back to Colin.
I'm not a big believer in what we're doing tonight, okay?
Yes, sir.
I'm really not. Because you really should have had her be the presenter. She's a much better presenter than him or anybody else on your team.
Yes, sir. Mr. Trump, with her signing off and having a negative attitude and not having any enthusiasm
you know what?
for the
With a
cause.
bad attitude, she's a better presenter than anybody else on your team. That's my opinion. So you picked the wrong clinic and you picked the wrong presenter. And then George and Carolyn are saying, oh, I think Angie's wonderful. Okay, she's great. And I got to listen to them.
Do you have to?
No, I really don't, but I'm going to. You're a real wise guy, you know that?
It's a dumb statement. I was just asking if, that was a dumb statement.
Yeah. No, but you are a wise guy. There's no question about it. You know what, Aaron? You're fired.
So if people had no idea who Donald Trump was before The Apprentice, then he was fully imprinted on the American zeitgeist. Here's the guy who writes about it, James Poniewozik, author of Audience of One, Donald Trump Television and the Fracturing of America, also chief television critic for the New York Times. So much going on there with Apprentice, but this is the place, right, that Donald Trump, the television character, really comes into full flower in a way that's somewhat predictive of his success in the political theater.
Yeah, exactly. You started this off with him talking to Rona Barrett in 1980 and saying that, in the television era, television rewards the nice guy with the big smile. Well, this is not that guy, right? Now, we're in an era where Donald Trump can be the anti-hero on TV and be a hit for it and be the guy who tells people that they stink and that they failed and that, they're just not good enough and they're fired. And people eat it up. That is a big change from the mass media era that he launched in just, a couple decades before that.
Right. I think another thing that changes, just to go back to that least offensive program concept, is, that era of television was kind of about teams and functioning teams. So, I mean, if you got rid of somebody from Gilligan's Island every week, the series would be over pretty fast. The whole idea was, how are these people going to get along on Gilligan's Island? Except for Chuckles the Clown, nobody dies on the Mary Tyler Moore Show because you want all those people there every week. You want to come back to them. They're a surrogate family. They're a functioning team. Star Trek was about, people who are trapped in this kind of office that's going through space. They have to get along. They have to figure out how to collaborate. And then reality television comes along. And reality television, a lot of these shows, Survivor, Apprentice, The Bachelor, they're about getting rid of somebody every week, which I think is sort of a fantasy that Americans have too. What if I could get rid of somebody I don't like every week? And Trump becomes the king of that.
And it's about a zero-sum game, right? Like, Gunsmoke was, a functioning community and everybody's got to pull together to beat the bad guys. But here it's somebody's success must come at your expense. And for you to succeed, somebody else must fail. And somebody is out to take your stuff, to take your prize away from you. And you have got to work against them and get them booted off to, get your place at the, in this case, literally the table, in the boardroom. And, that's where Donald Trump lives. Like, that's where that persona, starting from the, sort of pinstriped 80s Reagan era shark, back then, that has sort of been the core of him. And now this is primetime TV material.
Right. And I think the other thing you hear in that clip, I hadn't really thought about it before, but, Trump is also the umpire. I mean, he's the umpire on that show. He decides who's in and who's out. And that happened on kind of a parallel track with TV News' erosion of its role as the umpire. Cronkite used to sign off his newscast with, and that's the way it is. And that was pretty much the way that it was. Cronkite, Brinkley, those kinds of people could tell you sort of what was going on in reality, could make a sort of Solomonic judgment about something like the Vietnam War. Now if Cronkite had to sign off, he'd probably have to say, and that's one possible interpretation of reality.
Yeah.
But so we're desperate for an umpire, and News isn't really doing it anymore, although you see Trump doing it over there.
Yeah, and one thing that The Apprentice is doing for him is that it's bringing the powers of television to sort of edit him into a decisive leader, the guy who calls the shots, and he makes the decisions, and maybe sometimes they're tough or mean decisions, but they're the right decisions, right? Now, sometimes they weren't always the right decisions. As producers on The Apprentice have said, he would sometimes make sort of arbitrary decisions in the boardroom because somebody had annoyed him and he didn't like the way they looked that day or whatever, and they would look at each other and say, well, we've got to make sense of this. There was nothing in the challenge that led to this. So they would retroactively edit it. But the cumulative effect is that the product that you get on TV is decisive, straight shooting, well admired, and authoritative Donald Trump.
Right. And I think, by 2016, the umpires of News have so completely handed the keys over to some crazy drunk guy in the stands that Mika and Joe aren't even in control of when Trump comes on Morning Joe. He could just call up and he books himself. They're not even booking him as a guest for their own show. He's now in control of that.
It's the guests that are driving the train, and it's the audience, and what the audience wants to be, provoked or entertained by that's driving the train. And it's going on, as you're saying, as the Apprentice is going on. It's kind of this time of this broader crisis in American expertise and authority, Enron, the WMDs that didn't turn up, all this notion of you can't trust the traditional shot callers to call the shots.
So you had, and I'm sure you enjoy these, like in the post-mortem they do at Harvard after the election, you had Jeff Zucker from CNN being booed by the audience, and one of Rubio's advisors yells, "You showed empty podiums. You showed hours upon hours of unfiltered, unscripted coverage of Trump. This was not about interviews." And he's right, that ultimately CNN knuckled under too and said, "Look, you're just such great television. You're so good for the bottom line." Moonves admitted that at CBS too. We'll just do whatever you want us to do.
Yeah, Moonves said this may be bad for America, but it's great for CBS. And Jeff Zucker, I mean, he was the executive at NBC that put the Apprentice on. Jeff Zucker, sort of understood instinctively that if your audience is telling you they want something, you give them 10 times as much of it, which was one thing that sort of burned out the Apprentice's ratings over time, frankly, because the extent to which they scheduled it and kind of burned out that franchise. But yeah, what the audience was saying in the 2016 election, whether they loved Trump or whether they hated Trump, was that they would tune in for this insane scenario where Donald frickin' Trump, the guy from the 80s, was running for president, and he could say anything, and he was news even if he wasn't doing anything, even if he wasn't there and was just his podium, because who knows what's going to happen next. And who knows what's going to happen next is basically the business model of cable news.
Okay, you get 60 seconds left. Do you have any positive, hopeful message for those of us who would like the restoration of sanity in our culture?
Sure. I think that people are capable of getting burned out on a television phenomenon, as we were just saying, and deciding that, they want to take some responsibility and turn to something more sensible. And, I would also say, maybe we've moved into the area of reality TV politics, but reality TV is not the only kind of TV that works on television. There are more sort of, uplifting positive messages that can come through and grab an audience. So, this is not necessarily our world forever and ever.
Yeah. Game of Thrones seemed like a really big deal.
Yeah.
to me, I was obsessed with Game of Thrones.
Yeah.
Now I can't believe I watched Game of Thrones. So maybe that is the way that we have a little bit of hope for the future. James Poniewozik from the New York Times is the author of Audience of One, Donald Trump, Television and the Fracturing of America. It's great talking to you, sir.
Yeah, thanks so much. That was a great talk.
All right.